Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the AWS Lunch and Learn on Advanced Federation Techniques. With me today is my colleague and Quentin Van Diemen, who will introduce himself in a couple moments. Just a quick things on logistics. So we're going to start off with about 15 minutes of Quint presenting some excellent advanced techniques for how to set up AWS as an application in your IDP, especially if you have things like multiple AWS accounts. At many of the tables, you will find little white signs with things like Cognito, IAM, Cloud Directory. Seated at those tables shortly will be your local AWS expert on those services or those topics. Once Quint finishes and we answer some Q&A on Federation, feel free to go to the table, ask your local expert about any questions you may have. And really, today's about letting you ask questions and get to know our team and learn more about AWS on our services to make sure you're maximizing our identity capabilities. So with that, thank you again very much for attending, and I'll hand it over to Quint.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Quint Van Diemen, and I'm the Business Development Manager for Identity and Directory Services. Now, don't let that title scare you. For my first 2.5 years at Amazon, I spent as part of our professional services organization going around helping some of AWS's largest customers work through their federation and general their identity strategies and approaches. And that's really kind of the perspective that I'm talking to you here from today. So now I give this talk a lot, but I normally give it to talk of rooms full of folks that are oriented around AWS and have just, I just have a little bit of a feel or a flavor in the world of identity. And arguably here today, we've got exactly the opposite. So I'm going to try to speed things up at places, slow things down in others. But by all means, if something doesn't jive for you while we go through this, after the fact, let's make sure we get it squared away. So I think that the room here would probably all understand the basics of this slide, right? But when we talk about why we do federation for AWS, we always talk about these three constituencies. And the users are pretty obvious, right? We don't want them to have a unique credential. But the second one, maybe I'll take a little bit of time on. AWS has some unique credential forms, things like access keys, secret keys, that arguably to a room of identity and security professionals probably feel comfortable, but to your average DevOps engineer or developer are a little bit of a new thing. And they tend to take those credentials and stick them in all sorts of source code control and other places that they arguably shouldn't. And in the world of federation, a really nice side benefit we get beyond SSO for our end users is we get these naturally self-expiring credentials, and that's really a big win. And then the last one, again, probably makes sense for you all, but just to level set, in the world without federation, you're going to have to do all that onboarding, offboarding, attestation, all those types of processes one-off in AWS. When we get in the world of federation, we kind of get natural alignment. We get just synergy with how everybody's doing identity management on-prem. So all that's kind of taken care of for us. So now, what we're talking about here today is principally kind of the inbound federation case, right? This is federation into the AWS Management Console and API layer. We support both OpenID Connect and SAML-based federation for this type of federation. But principally, we find that most enterprise customers in particular are still going with SAML for this type of federation. AWS supports the IDP-initiated login flow, right? And so that's not going to be your traditional service provider-oriented flow. But again, I'll kind of assume that most of the audience in this crowd understands kind of the flow that's at hand here. And really, the only kind of unique thing from the user's perspective is just that we're going to replace that bookmark, that shortcut, or that they're going to initiate their access into AWS from being an AWS-oriented URL to one that's targeted at your identity provider. So now, I've been here at CIS for a couple days, noticed a lot of PowerPoint. Maybe it's a little bit of, revolt on my part on that, and maybe a little bit of just the Amazonian way. But I think we're going to try to do the rest of this as a little bit of a lively demo. So I'm going to try to jam a bunch of stuff in here. I'll try not to go at Mach speed, but at the end of what I'm going to show you today, I'm going to leave you with some links to some materials where you'll be able to go through this at your own pace, at your own level of depth, in a totally self-service way that you can explore on your own time. So with that aside, you're going to see me use both Firefox and Chrome. Firefox is going to be kind of the administrator's view. Chrome is going to be the user's view. So first, let's start with just the basic 101 of how we need to do or how we need to set up federation. So we got the AWS Management Console here. And all of this first integration is going to happen within our IAM, our Identity and Access Management Service. As you'd expect, the first thing I need to do is configure an identity provider. As I do so, you would probably notice that I have a number of them already there. Kind of a nice feature is that we support up to 100 identity providers concurrently, and that provides for all sorts of experimentation, migration, and other patterns. But to set up the one that I'm interested in here, I'm going to provide what you'd expect, a little bit of a name, an indication that's SAML-based, and my metadata for that provider. I need not tell you all, but that's obviously the basis of the cryptographic trust, in which AWS is going to be able to consume the identities from your provider and do those effectively. So the next thing that I need to build within AWS is the notion of a role. And a role, if you're not familiar with our platform as deeply, is a little bit of a Swiss Army knife that we use a lot within the platform. It's used in a lot of different ways. But here, you're going to see me, and you're going to have to apologize, the resolution here leaves a little bit to be desired, but I'm going to build some roles for identity provider access. You're going to see I'm referencing the SAML provider that I just configured. I need to establish what's known as the trust document, right? So this is where it says that in order to assume this role, I had to be a federated principal from that specific identity provider with AWS as the audience of the assertion. I'm going to attach a AWS policy. So this is where we bring in the fine-grained permissions for AWS APIs and resources. And then I just need to give it a name. And just to make things interesting for when we demo things, I'm going to do that once over again. And maybe this time we'll do a little bit more of a power user type approach. Certainly, the policies that I'm attaching here are what's known as AWS managed policies, but these are kind of our little easy button, a get-going approach to policies, but certainly, as you'll see as we go on, there's much more depth under the hood for being able to do custom approaches there. Okay, so I've got my two roles. I've got my identity provider. At that point, I'm kind of done with the AWS side. So now, if I flip to the identity provider side, I already had my identity provider established, right? I'm going to, as I probably tipped my hand already, being an open source guy at heart, I'm using Shibboleth here. I already did the dance in bringing in the metadata coming back the other way, and I'm going to focus here on kind of what's the unique part of Federation for AWS, which are some of the custom SAML assertion variables that we use for this. Certainly, there's three in particular. There's name ID, which is just the standard persistent identifier that's going to come from your identity provider. The next one is, and hopefully you all can see the screen here, but is the AWS role session name. This is generally very important because this is what's going to give you traceability into our logging and auditing systems, services like AWS CloudTrail, if you're familiar. So we're generally going to see those set to non-repeatable attributes like UID or email address. But the real one that I want to draw your attention to here is this definition for the AWS roles attribute. And the reason this is so important is this is your identity provider asserting which of those roles that you've pre-configured this specific user is allowed to assume, right? And we'll see this play out as we go on. Now, if you read the AWS documentation, certainly this role could be just simply statically configured. But as your AWS environment grows and you have lots of users with lots of roles, that's not terribly useful. What's much more the prevailing pattern is what you see here, where we draw in group memberships from the backend directory, and we name them in standardized patterns. Here you can see that I'm prefixing the group name with AWS, then I've got a 12-digit number representative of the AWS account number, and then I've got the role name. And what's great is if I name my groups in that way, I've essentially got everything at hand to be able to dynamically generate these pairs of common delimited values which specify those what's known as an ARN, the Amazon Resource Name, that specifically identifies the role that the user is allowed to assume and the identity provider that's responsible for vouching for it. And if we can get to, in the identity provider of your choice, a pattern where these values are built in this dynamic way, this becomes a set it once and forget it type of configuration, your identity provider, that's really powerful.
Can you explain what the source value is supposed to be? Is it the identity of the users?
So what's going on under the hood here is that the user has logged into my identity provider. My IDP is going to query all the groups memberships on behalf of that user and use those group memberships and transform the group names into the specific role ARNs and identity provider ARNs that are needed here.
So those are roles to groups to user.
Yes, certainly. And I'd be happy to elaborate after we kind of get through things here. Okay, so certainly what I've done kind of behind the scenes here in preps is I've put one of my test users into a number of those groups in the directory that would be represented there. So let's see what this looks like from kind of the user's perspective, right? And this is always the dangerous part of the demo, because demonstrating a login aside from a room full of identity folks is not terribly the most interesting thing. But so I come here, I've hit my identity provider URL, and I'm going to just, forgive the AWS logo. This is, in fact, my just my IDP login. I'm going to enter my corporate credentials. And what's kind of gone on in the background here is, again, what we just discussed. My identity provider went, queried the backend directory, fetched the group memberships that I was a part of, and is arriving at what's known as the role chooser page, where this is where AWS has consumed the assertion. It has seen that my identity provider has asserted that I am, in fact, authorized for these two roles, and then I, as the user now, can choose which context I want to operate in. And then, forgive slow internet in the basement here aside. Ultimately, as you all would expect, I land there at the AWS console. Now I go about my work. I do everything. I'm bound by the rights of that policy I attached to that role. But when I want to go and operate in perhaps a different context, when I want to elevate my privileges, I hit that IDP initiated login URL again. My IDP obviously knows that I'm still authenticated. I get a fresh assertion back to AWS. I choose my new context, and I go on and go forth. So that's a really powerful privilege for or a powerful technique for kind of implementing that. The user should be contextual to what they're doing, not just contextual to what they have. So certainly we can spin that out, and so we like to say that the console is a little bit of the training wheels for AWS, right? As you get deeper into the cloud world, you're driving more towards CLI and API type access. So we can extend the same concept out to those realms as well. In the materials I'm going to show, it'll provide pointers to all these things, but we usually facilitate this with a little bit of a helper script. But again, you can see I enter my enterprise credentials. I get the same sort of selection in terms of the role I want to operate in, and then I can go about using any of the AWS ALI, or CLI or API calls, just like I normally would, simply by specifying here, this extra profile attribute. So that has in the background fetched a short-term credential for me. It's valid for an hour, lets me do whatever I want, just like I normally would. But again, I haven't had, as a developer, any long-term credentials hanging around to have to do this sort of thing. And again, we're not going to let the slow internet kind of bog us down on time. So that's kind of the 101. That gets us going. But what we really find in the modern day and age is that almost all AWS customers of reasonable size are going to spin out to have lots of AWS accounts, lots of roles, and we want to be essentially we want to be able to take that and spread that out across that whole fleet of things. So to do so in kind of the AWS world, we're really going to turn to some basic automation. This is a set of automation that might show you how to do this. I will not say that it is the prettiest or most beautiful, but it certainly gets the job done. But essentially what I've done here is I've created a set of just very simple files that kind of describe my environment. I've got one that describes my accounts, one that describes my roles, and essentially a bunch of policy documents that describe what those roles should be able to do. And what I need to do is essentially from a trusted place, in this case my laptop, but but normally this would exist within a trusted place within your AWS environment. I want to push that out to all of my distributed AWS accounts. So I'm going to, first I'm going to push the Federation provider. This is going to, as a pretty sensitive operation, we've kind of wired this in to MFA. So I'll authenticate there. And then you can see what this is actually doing is a little bit of a different federation technology that we have in AWS. This is using what's known as cross-account trust to go from the main AWS account I normally operate in into all those other accounts, grab that metadata, and push that configuration. So what you saw me do in the console, one time over, I just replicated in 5 different accounts as essentially as fast as the computer could go. And I'll do the same thing for roles here. So again, what we're kind of doing in just a couple of minutes or just a couple of seconds is essentially replicating all that console work many, many accounts over. And that's really powerful and important as you start to span out. You don't want people checking the wrong box. By doing this through code, you ensure that you get the same result every time. I think you all know that story. So that takes care of kind of scaling things out on the AWS side. We need to also scale out the source directory side. In this case, just to kind of line up with Shibboleth, I'm using OpenLDAP. So I'm going to, I've got another couple of scripts that are just going to generate some basic LDIF files that will create the group structure that follows that same naming convention that you saw me use a second ago. So let's see if let's load our LDIFs, and that'll make it a little bit more obvious here. So I'm just, again, what you're seeing me do is create just basic groups that follow this naming convention that I described earlier. They're just empty at this point. This is where your natural identity systems on-premise would come in. Users would, through whatever workflow engine, entitlement engine you have, would need to request access to these groups. It would logically go to an approver, and they would be placed into those groups. I'm going to do things a little bit more cooking show style for the interest of time here, and I'm going to take one of my test users and just load them into a number of different groups. Okay, so let's flip back here. We'll close that one out. We'll get a new incognito window. Come back to initial login, and this time it's same as before. But when I log in, you're going to see that my user here is presented with a much more broad set of options, right? And again, this is very useful for switching context from dev to prod or from app A to app B, whatever your account segmentation plan is. And you can also notice that I have the ability to give my user different roles in different accounts. And so this is again, all principle of least privilege. We may give someone rather liberal access in a dev account, but we want very constrained appropriate privileges in a production account. And I won't, in the interest of time, I won't show you the dance again, but the same rule applies. If I'm operating in one account and one role, and I want to switch context to just come back here. So the last thing I'd like to kind of show you is how you extend the notion. There are some, especially for super user type privileges in AWS, it's a very powerful role. It's a very powerful entitlement. And so we really want to bring the notion of strong auth or MFA into that equation. To do so, obviously when you're in a federated approach, the MFA itself occurs on the identity provider side, but there's some defense and depth techniques that we can use to bring that over to AWS. So what I've done here is I've pre-configured my Shibboleth instance with Duo as a secondary auth. That was a little arbitrary. It doesn't particularly matter. But what I've done is I've added another assertion attribute that's going to draw in my principal authentication method. And it's going to, the screen wrapping doesn't do a super great job here, but it's going to load that into the EDU person assurance attribute. And that's an attribute that AWS is able to consume and understand. So if I go back and I look at my AWS side, if I look at that super user role that I pre-configured, what I can do here is, in addition to the standard trust policy conditions that require that the audience be AWS for the assertion, I can put in extra conditions. And again, here you can see where I'm drawing in that EDU person assurance attribute and making sure that the user, in order to assume this very powerful role, has been authenticated with Duo. So if I come back here, you'll remember when I was operating as my user a second ago, I very clearly did not. I just operated with username and password. And we'll show the failure case first. Again, remember, this is a defense in depth. Normally, we wouldn't expect the user to ever get here without having been properly MFA authenticated. But should whatever human error introduce that set of circumstances, you can see very clearly that, this is a little bit of the rough edge of the solution. They don't get the most, beautiful error message, but they certainly, at the end of the day, we prevent them from actually doing the action. So let's bump up here, and now we'll go ahead and we'll kind of force things in. We'll bring up, so I didn't get re-challenge again for username and password because I'd obviously passed that. We're going to do the little duo thing here. I'll confirm it on my phone, go in, and now I've bumped up my authentication method. And now when I land back in here, away I go. Slow internet aside. Okay. So that is kind of in a really quick mock speed fashion, kind of how you do the inbound federation side of AWS. Now here in the room, as Arturo mentioned, we've got a lot of other identity and federation focused services. We've got the Cognito team here, which is all about how you add sign up, sign in, and federated access to AWS APIs for your web and mobile apps and other use cases. We've got the directory services team here, which is all about bringing native AD into your AWS environment, either for authentication to AWS services like QuickSight and Workspaces, or maybe your own .NET apps that are running in AWS. And then we've certainly got just the IAM team represented here, which is consuming your federated identities and applying the very AWS-specific fine-grained access controls to APIs and to resources. And then, keystroke aside, we've also got kind of some ancillary, or not ancillary, but supporting services, things like AWS organizations, the short-term token service that you saw kind of working under the hood there, and Cloud Directory and other technologies. So hope you guys enjoy the opportunity to meet and talk with those experts in the next couple minutes. So with that, thanks, Arturo. Really appreciate the time, everybody.
So before we break out into the groups, any questions for Quint on the stuff he demonstrated today or the material he presented?
If the identity service provider requires a multi-factor authentication, will that natively pass to AWS, or do you have to always configure it on the AWS side as well?
So AWS has a specific set of SAML assertion attributes that it understands, right? And that isn't the world of SAML assertion attributes. And so as long as you can box your assertion into one of the variables we understand, there's nothing extra that needs to be configured, right? And that's the only part that you need to do. Does that make sense?
I heard that AWS does not support ASP-initiated single sign-on. And the other question is, do you support a multiple environment? Dev, QA, and production?
So let me tackle that kind of one at a time, right? So on the SP initiated, you're correct, right? Imagine the challenge for AWS there. With SP initiated, there's a lot more. Like, we would have to essentially establish an endpoint for every one of the millions of AWS customers. So I appreciate that maybe means some legwork on your side, but it's a scaling function for us. In terms of Dev, QA, Prod, as I showed, you can support up to 100 identity providers concurrently. So that would be your avenue within your different accounts or across your different accounts of supporting your different levels of testing identity providers. So that would certainly be supported. Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so following up on the SP initiated, thank you. Following up on the SP initiated, right, a big driver for that is to do deep linking. Okay. So do you have an alternative mechanism for implementing deep linking?
So we do support relay states, right? Which you're able. It requires a little bit of legwork, right? But we do have mechanisms such that you can craft those deep linked URLs using relay states. It might not be perfect, but that would be the approach that we have.
Okay, and one other question. If you have an environment where your your workforce and your customers are in two different identity repositories. And your workforce is going to be developing most of the applications for the benefit of your customers. That's a configuration that's supported here, presumably?
Certainly. So again, in the case where your workforce and your customer, so everything I showed there was about federated access to the AWS APIs themselves, right? Access to the applications which might reside on top of that, which your customers would arguably be more federating into, is essentially there's not a super deep connection between the two. So at that point, apps running on top of AWS would federate to your identity provider just as they naturally and normally would. But if there were the case that you needed to give your customers API access directly, again, multiple IDPs are supported. You can bring them in the same way, or you can look at services like Cognito, which might be more appropriate for those types of cases.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I did kind of want to touch on the SPNet and the relay state issue again. So we've actually found that to be a barrier to adoption in some places. We have about 80 AWS accounts, and they're all federated through an IDP. And we've got most of what you demonstrated taken care of and automated, and we can push policies and all that junk. But when it comes to leveraging a service like AppStream, for example, where that relay state suddenly becomes a really important factor in delivering that to our customers, that's really clunky because relay state is typically a part of the SPNet profile, and tacking it onto the IDPNet profile isn't really how that normally works.
Sure.
And the IDPs that we're all using aren't going to have the ability to dynamically generate a relay state, which put us in a position where we just couldn't leverage AppStream at the scale that we wanted to do it at. One of the other obstacles that we have is what you said. It's difficult for you to scale supporting the same IDP twice, basically. At the same time, that means the scale for us, instead of supporting two entity IDs on your end or two ACS on your end, is we have to then deploy two full IDPs, which is a much more challenging scaling mechanic.
Right.
So is that really just the end answer, is that those are the final states for that solution? Because honestly, that's a big gap.
So I would say that in today's AWS world, that's what we've got, right? But if you've been around the AWS world long enough, you'll know that we say, and we genuinely mean, that 90% of our roadmap comes from customer feedback, right? And so this is a great forum, and you've got the experts here. Let's get one of the Amazonians with you, write out kind of the use cases and the depth behind that, and then we can work to get that in the roadmap. And that's not an empty promise. It's not a statement of we're going to do this next week at the flip side, but certainly that is the way this works. So today, that's the answer we've got, but would love to get your feedback, would love to get the deeper use case so we can see how we can get that into the roadmap.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Cool. With that, please go ahead and find a table, and your experts will answer your questions.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.